I'm taking her inside now.
Let go! Don't touch my child!
The screech of Karen Bellamy's heels echoed across the playground, cutting through the laughter of children like a knife. I froze as I saw her grip Emily's arm, tugging her with a force that made my stomach twist. "Rules are rules!" the board chair snapped, her clipboard shaking with authority. My daughter's small frame wobbled as she tried to pull free, prosthetic arm catching the sun and glinting sharply. "Where are you watching from?" I thought, hoping someone would see the injustice unfolding before their eyes. I stepped forward, my voice steady but firm. "Let go of her now, Karen." The enforcer in crimson smirked, barely acknowledging me, her eyes cold and calculating. She didn't even blink when she tightened her hold. That's when I noticed Naomi, hovering near the HOA office, her expression conflicted, hands clasped nervously. She wanted to intervene, but didn't. My mind raced. I had seconds to act. I pulled my phone from my pocket, fingers trembling. "This isn't just playground property," I said, though my voice was low, more a warning than a plea. The clipboard queen tilted her head, curiosity flashing for a split second before smugness returned. My thumb hovered over the emergency dial. I'd called 911 before in smaller disputes, but this felt different. I could feel the weight of Emily's fear and the injustice pressing down like a physical force. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. I whispered it under my breath, more as a promise to myself than the world, my hands steadying. Karen Bellamy, the tyrant in heels, finally looked at me with a flicker of doubt, like she realized I wasn't just some passive neighbor to push around. I've always been calm under pressure. Years as a civil engineer trained me to calculate risks instantly, anticipate structural weaknesses, and act before disaster. I carried that precision into every part of my life, but nothing prepared me for seeing my daughter yanked by someone whose authority was self-proclaimed and cruel. Karen's face twisted with satisfaction, the board chair convinced she held all the power. She didn't see the law standing silently beside me. Emily's small hand reached toward mine, her prosthetic arm catching the glint of the afternoon sun. That prosthetic was more than a limb. It was a testament to her strength, a reminder of the accident that could have broken us, but hadn't. Each second that Karen Bellamy pulled her closer made my pulse spike, my jaw tighten, and my brain race through options. The enforcer in crimson thought she was untouchable. She underestimated every silent preparation, every legal safeguard I had quietly in place for years. I took a deliberate step forward, the sound of gravel under my boots masking the racing in my heart. "Enough," I said, letting my calm mask the fury beneath. The clipboard queen's eyes narrowed, scanning for any sign of weakness. Naomi's gaze flickered toward us again, internal conflict written in every twitch of her fingers, every bite of her lip. She could help, or she could watch, paralyzed. My mind went to the symbolic playground bench where Emily had spent countless afternoons laughing, drawing chalk worlds of hope and imagination. That bench wasn't just a piece of wood, it was safety, freedom, a childhood untainted by control freaks and overreaching rules. Karen Bellamy, the tyrant in heels, had turned it into a stage for humiliation, and I wasn't going to let her win. Time slowed. My hand tightened on the phone. My voice remained steady, my presence unyielding. And in that moment, I knew the board chair's arrogance was about to meet the weight of authority she had ignored for far too long. The air still crackled with tension from the playground when Karen Bellamy, the clipboard queen, marched back toward the HOA office, her heels clicking like a metronome of intimidation. I followed, Emily clutching my hand, her small face pale but determined. Around us, neighbors lingered, some whispering, some pretending not to notice. The enforcer in crimson thought she could scare everyone into silence, but her performance only drew attention. Every step she took felt like a challenge, daring me to respond. I caught Naomi Cruz's eyes again, flickering between fear and guilt. The conflicted witness couldn't deny what she had seen. The way Karen Bellamy had yanked my daughter by the hair, as if rules justified cruelty. My pulse quickened, and a thought hit me. Her hesitation could become our leverage. The board chair thrived on fear, but fear only works when it's one-sided. Emily's small fingers squeezed mine, grounding me, reminding me this wasn't just about rules, it was about justice. The tyrant in heels didn't even glance at the mounting anger around her, confident her authority made her untouchable. I observed her gait, her posture, how she relished every step of control. Years of managing complex construction projects had trained me to notice such patterns. The small tells, the overconfidence, the predictable mistakes. If she underestimated the impact of witnesses and authority outside her narrow realm, that miscalculation would cost her. I glanced around the neighborhood square, noticing the subtle ways her influence extended. Signs posted in uniform script, reminders of violations that seemed trivial but kept everyone anxious. The clipboard queen thrived on this orchestration of small fears, but every rule she enforced without reason left a trail, a breadcrumb path to expose her overreach. Naomi's hesitance could tip the scales. I needed her to see she had a choice. I led Emily toward the community garden, a symbolic space where residents nurtured life, creativity, and trust. Everything Karen Bellamy sought to control. The enforcer in crimson would never understand that power isn't in domination, but in connection. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, curious and uneasy. Their eyes lingered on Emily, on me, on the clipboard queen striding past, her confidence meeting subtle cracks she couldn't hide. I remembered the incident at the HOA meeting last month. Karen Bellamy demanding fines for unauthorized play structures, while overlooking her own violations. That history gave me clarity. Patterns repeated, arrogance persisted, and authority ignored accountability. The board chair's behavior wasn't isolated, it was systemic. And systematic errors, when observed carefully, become undeniable proof. Naomi shifted, subtly glancing at Karen Bellamy's retreating figure, then toward me, her lips pressed together, jaw tightening. The conflicted witness couldn't unsee the injustice and might be willing to tip her hand. I needed to make that safe, to show her that siding with integrity wouldn't ruin her. The tyrant in heels thrived on compliance, not courage. That was our opening. Emily's prosthetic arm caught the light again, an unspoken declaration of resilience. Karen Bellamy hadn't broken her. She'd only revealed the child's strength in the face of cruelty. The playground incident was now a spark. The neighborhood was taking notice. Whispers began turning to questions. The enforcer in crimson didn't know that visibility was dangerous to her control. I exhaled slowly, noting the subtle shift in atmosphere. Fear was no longer absolute. Naomi's gaze lingered, the conflicted witness now aware she could act. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, thought she had silenced dissent, but in the shadows of authority, the seeds of accountability were already taking root, and once they sprouted, they couldn't be ignored. The afternoon sun glinted off Emily's prosthetic, the garden benches, and the neat lines of homes surrounding us. Every element of the neighborhood had become a stage for the inevitable confrontation. The clipboard queen might strut in her self-assured tyranny, but the community was awakening, and I was ready. The tension lingered like a thick fog over the community center as Karen Bellamy, the tyrant in heels, held court near the entrance. I stood just inside, Emily close, sensing the energy shift as neighbors trickled in, hesitant and curious. The clipboard queen paced, scanning the room with the arrogance of someone convinced she controlled every gaze, every whisper. Yet, Naomi Cruz, the conflicted witness, hovered at the periphery, eyes darting between Karen Bellamy and me. Her posture spoke volumes, shoulders hunched, hands clasped tightly, shifting weight as if each step carried the weight of her conscience. The enforcer in crimson approached a small group of homeowners, pointing out minor infractions with a mechanical precision, unaware that each accusation drew subtle glances toward her own overreach. I could see Naomi flinch at every pointed finger, her internal struggle intensifying. Her eyes betrayed guilt, uncertainty, a silent question hanging. Could she intervene without destroying herself within the HOA machine? The board chair thrived on compliance, but fear was a fragile ally. Naomi's hesitation was now the fulcrum on which the outcome could pivot. Karen Bellamy lifted a clipboard, her sharp nails tapping like a metronome of authority. "Everyone here must follow the rules," she said, voice clipped, measured, leaving no room for argument. The tyrant in heels radiated power, yet I noticed a subtle tremor in her hand as she adjusted her papers, a crack in the armor she didn't know existed. Emily tugged at my sleeve, her wide eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. That small tug grounded me, reminding me what this was truly about. I watched Naomi fidget, gaze flicking between Karen Bellamy and me, caught in a silent tug of war. The conflicted witness's hands hovered near her chest, twisting a ring, her feet shifting like she wanted to step forward but feared the consequences. Every inch of her body language screamed indecision, a battle between loyalty to the tyrant in heels and an undeniable moral obligation. This subtle tension became a secret weapon, an unspoken narrative that the board chair could never predict. As the clipboard queen moved closer to deliver another pointed remark, I leaned toward Naomi without drawing attention, my voice barely a whisper. "You saw it. You know what's right." Her eyes widened slightly, the first flicker of recognition crossing her features. The enforcer in crimson was powerful, but she wasn't omniscient. The conflicted witness held potential to shift the balance, a quiet ripple that could grow into a wave of accountability. Karen Bellamy's gaze scanned the room again, landing briefly on Emily and me. The board chair's arrogance assumed we'd shrink, remain passive, that compliance would keep the neighborhood quiet. But each stare, each calculated movement I made signaled the opposite. The tyrant in heels had underestimated visibility, the power of witnesses, of subtle observation, of community watching. The clipboard queen's control relied on intimidation, but the more she pressed, the more cracks appeared. I noted every detail, every misstep, every tremor of the enforcer in crimson. Years of professional training taught me to observe patterns, predict behavior. Each hesitation, each glance, each physical tell, these were threads I could pull to unravel her authority. Naomi's internal struggle was the first stitch in the tapestry we could weave together. The conflicted witness might fear immediate reprisal, but fear couldn't override the innate sense of justice building inside her. Emily shifted, her small hand gripping mine, and I saw a quiet determination settle in Naomi. The clipboard queen had relied on her silence. Now silence was becoming her weakness. Karen Bellamy had engineered fear into a weapon, but fear is fragile, especially when confronted by undeniable truth and human connection. The tyrant in heels straightened, confident, unaware of the potential betrayal building quietly in Naomi's conscience. Each second that passed brought us closer to a turning point, the moment when observation, morality, and courage intersected. The board chair's power had limits, and the conflicted witness was beginning to see them. I exhaled slowly, feeling the energy shift. Karen Bellamy's aura of control was unshakable only to those who chose to submit. Naomi's hesitation promised an opening, a chance to convert uncertainty into decisive action. Emily's presence amplified the stakes, turning a quiet struggle into a charged battlefield of authority, conscience, and justice. The tension outside the community center had escalated. Karen Bellamy, the enforcer in crimson, now stood rigid beside the wrought iron gate, clipboard clutched like a weapon. She scanned the sidewalk with practiced authority, eyes narrowing at any homeowner daring to approach. The tyrant in heels was relentless, and her presence alone made neighbors hesitate. But I had Emily safely at my side, her small fingers curled around mine, and my resolve hardened with each passing second. The board chair had crossed a line, and the air vibrated with unspoken conflict. I stepped forward as Karen Bellamy's sharp gaze found me. The clipboard queen's lips pressed into a thin line, her posture rigid, but I noticed the subtle tightening of her jaw. Every movement screamed control, yet I could see the first traces of irritation flicker across her expression. She thought the enforcer in crimson's reputation would keep me in check, that her authority alone could intimidate a father protecting his child. The board chair had underestimated one thing: my patience, my observation, and the law on my side. A car door slammed nearby, startling Emily, and I instinctively shielded her. Karen Bellamy's eyes followed the motion with mechanical precision. The tyrant in heels raised her clipboard, tapping it sharply. "This is a violation," she declared, voice carrying across the asphalt, echoing in the quiet tension of the suburban street. Her tone was both accusatory and smug, a combination designed to crush any pushback. The clipboard queen thrived on these moments, believing her power to be absolute. Neighbors peeked from behind hedges and cars, sensing the confrontation's severity. Naomi Cruz lingered just out of sight, shifting uneasily, caught between fear and conscience. The conflicted witness had been observing Karen Bellamy's escalation closely, her hesitation growing into doubt. The board chair's relentless enforcement had painted her as a figure of tyranny, but to Naomi, the injustice unfolding was undeniable. Her internal struggle was now visible in small gestures, fingers twisting, a foot tapping, eyes darting to Emily and me. Karen Bellamy advanced a few steps, the enforcer in crimson's authority radiating with each movement. "I will enforce the rules," she said, voice steady yet tense. The tyrant in heels believed that her rigid compliance with HOA regulations was beyond question, but each of her steps, each assertive gesture, revealed cracks in her performance of control. I observed her movements like patterns in a puzzle, ready to anticipate her next move. The board chair's overconfidence could become her undoing. Emily tugged at my sleeve, her small voice urgent. "Daddy." I bent slightly, calming her, while scanning the surroundings for witnesses or cameras. The clipboard queen's presence alone was unnerving, but the growing attention of neighbors could tilt the balance. Naomi's conflicted stance was our hidden advantage. The enforcer in crimson had relied on fear and intimidation, but fear is fragile when observed, when shared, when someone finally recognizes wrongdoing. I noticed Karen Bellamy checking her watch, a micro-expression of impatience flashing across her face. The tyrant in heels assumed her display of authority sufficed, but my awareness of every gesture allowed me to predict her moves. The board chair was unaware of the subtle alliances forming, of the internal dissent growing among those who had once complied without question. Naomi's conflicted conscience was a seed of disruption, ready to blossom into decisive action. As the sun angled lower, casting long shadows across the pavement, Karen Bellamy took a step closer to Emily. I positioned myself defensively, careful not to escalate physically, but ready to respond. The enforcer in crimson had assumed compliance would continue, but the quiet observation of neighbors, the watchful eyes of Naomi, and my strategic patience meant that her control was fragile. The clipboard queen was now on unstable ground, and every small decision she made carried the risk of exposure. The board chair's authority was rooted in fear, but fear could not survive the scrutiny of witness observation, moral confrontation, and visible injustice. Each of Karen Bellamy's movements amplified tension, but it also highlighted her overreach. The tyrant in heels, in her rigid enforcement, had created a stage where her own collapse could be inevitable. Naomi's internal struggle was now a visible thread, the first tangible sign that the balance of power could shift. Emily clung closer, sensing the danger, while I remained calm, scanning every motion, every expression. The enforcer in crimson had ignited a crisis, but her confidence was built on predictability. The board chair had unknowingly scripted the sequence that would lead to her downfall. Each second stretched, weighted with suspense, anticipation, and the unspoken knowledge that justice could arrive not through force, but through exposure, conscience, and strategy. The tension reached a breaking point the next morning. Karen Bellamy, the enforcer in crimson, had summoned the neighborhood under the guise of a safety inspection, her clipboard queen persona fully engaged. The tyrant in heels paced in front of the cul-de-sac, scanning every car, every lawn, every resident with sharp scrutiny. I stood at the edge of the crowd, Emily gripping my hand, her small fingers trembling but resolute. The board chair had escalated. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control. I observed Karen Bellamy closely, noting the rigid posture, the tight shoulders, the way she squared her jaw when anyone questioned her authority. The enforcer in crimson thrived on fear and predictability, but her overconfidence left openings. I had already begun tracking her movements, anticipating reactions, watching for any misstep that could expose her overreach. The clipboard queen's authority relied on intimidation, but intimidation falters under scrutiny. The tyrant in heels had underestimated one critical factor: my expertise in legal codes and compliance. Neighbors whispered among themselves, eyes flicking nervously toward Karen Bellamy. The board chair's presence radiated power, but beneath the polished exterior, cracks were forming. Naomi Cruz lingered near the periphery, her conflicted gaze betraying her inner turmoil. The enforcer in crimson didn't notice the subtle exchange of glances, the silent acknowledgement that not everyone agreed with her harsh enforcement. Naomi's conscience was a weapon waiting to be deployed. Karen Bellamy stepped forward, tapping her clipboard. "Everyone must comply immediately," she announced, voice crisp and commanding. The tyrant in heels believed her word alone dictated obedience, but the murmurs among neighbors suggested resistance, quiet yet persistent. Emily tugged at my sleeve, sensing the rising tension. I bent down, whispering reassurance while maintaining a watchful eye. The clipboard queen's authority might be formidable, but strategy, patience, and leverage could counteract it. As Karen Bellamy inspected the parking spaces, I noticed subtle deviations from code, signage misaligned, permits missing, and spaces improperly marked. The enforcer in crimson had overlooked critical details in her zeal for control. The board chair's obsession with enforcing minor rules blinded her to the bigger picture, to the legal vulnerabilities that could dismantle her authority. My expertise in regulatory compliance allowed me to see these flaws as weapons in the coming confrontation. Neighbors started sharing hushed observations, pointing out inconsistencies Karen Bellamy missed. The tyrant in heels flicked her eyes toward the crowd, realizing some of her meticulous control was unraveling. Naomi stepped closer, her conflicted position now visible in her hesitant gestures and the subtle shake of her head. The clipboard queen had underestimated the collective awareness building among the residents. The board chair's escalation had sown the seeds of her own undoing. Emily shifted nervously, leaning against me as Karen Bellamy scrutinized a misaligned no parking sign. The enforcer in crimson failed to notice my focused observation, the quiet calculation behind every gesture, every assessment. The tyrant in heels had become predictable, her pattern established. Each overstep was a thread I could pull to expose the board chair's overreach, a crack in her meticulously constructed image of absolute authority. I spotted a minor violation, a faded handicap marker that hadn't been updated to code. Karen Bellamy leaned forward, clipboard poised to lecture, unaware that her enforcement was already vulnerable to challenge. The enforcer in crimson had overlooked critical details that I could legally leverage. Naomi's conflicted stance made her the perfect, inadvertent ally. Her observations could validate the discrepancies and build a case against the tyrant in heels without confrontation. Karen Bellamy's pace quickened, the clipboard queen moving from spot to spot, voice sharp and insistent, yet every step revealed a weakness, every gesture a miscalculation. I cataloged each misstep mentally, preparing the foundation for exposure. The enforcer in crimson assumed compliance and fear would protect her, but knowledge, expertise, and the subtle cooperation of the conflicted witness were already shifting the balance. The board chair was vulnerable, and I could feel the tides of authority starting to change. By midday, the crowd's tension was palpable. Neighbors whispered, some openly questioning Karen Bellamy's actions, while Naomi lingered closer, her conflicted presence growing stronger. The tyrant in heels scanned the crowd, sensing the shift yet unable to halt it. Every detail I observed, every minor code violation, and every hesitant glance from witnesses like Naomi fed into a larger strategy, a legal and psychological leverage that would soon dismantle the clipboard queen's dominion. The stage was set for confrontation, and I could see the first threads of Karen Bellamy's undoing taking shape. The tension I'd been tracking all morning finally boiled over that afternoon. Karen Bellamy, the enforcer in crimson, had grown impatient with the murmurs among neighbors. The tyrant in heels snapped her clipboard shut, her voice slicing through the heated whispers. "This stops now," she barked, glaring at anyone daring to question her authority. But I already knew the board chair had overplayed her hand. Her insistence on enforcing petty rules created openings I could exploit. Every misstep, every rigid gesture was evidence waiting to be framed. Emily clung to my side, her small face tight with anxiety. The clipboard queen had already singled out her, accusing her of crossing imaginary boundaries with the backyard fence. I knelt, whispering reassurances, hiding my own nerves behind a calm exterior. The enforcer in crimson hadn't anticipated that I could read her patterns, anticipate her escalation. Each flick of her wrist, each sharp nod to the gathered residents, reinforced the predictability of her authority. Neighbors were restless now, subtle glances, whispered commentary, tentative gestures. People were noticing the tyrant in heels' overreach. Karen Bellamy didn't yet realize that her escalation had inadvertently created an audience, one that could witness her missteps and ultimately question her power. I had already begun mentally mapping the pathway to leverage her mistakes. The board chair's insistence on domination left gaps only someone with careful observation and strategic patience could exploit. The enforcer in crimson moved toward the freshly painted handicap sign, clipboard in hand, ready to lecture. That moment was perfect. I had observed that the sign's placement violated municipal accessibility regulations. a detail Karen Bellamy had overlooked entirely. The tyrant in heels didn't notice me taking note, but it was enough to know that legal leverage was within reach. Every minor error she'd ignored or accelerated could soon be weaponized to dismantle her oppressive control. I caught Naomi Cruz's hesitant gaze from across the crowd. Her conflicted presence had grown more pronounced since this morning. The clipboard queen hadn't noticed how her own enforcer energy was creating cracks in the witness compliance. Naomi shifted closer, her internal struggle visible in subtle tension, a hand twisting at her jacket, a half step forward, a fleeting glance toward me. That conflicted witness, previously neutral, was edging toward pivotal assistance, a moment that could tip the balance in our favor. Karen Bellamy snapped at a neighbor for failing to align their mailbox. The enforcer in crimson's voice echoed across the street. The tyrant in heels' insistence on perfection only highlighted her rigid obsession with power. I noted her patterns, aggression increasing proportionally with neighborhood dissent, impatience building as small violations multiplied, and legal loopholes overlooked in her single-minded pursuit of control. The board chair's focus on petty enforcement blinded her to the broader consequences of her actions. Emily tightened her grip on my hand as Karen Bellamy marched past. The clipboard queen's approach was methodical, almost ceremonial, but each step reinforced predictability. I could see how the tyrant in heels relied entirely on fear and assumed compliance, yet she had underestimated the scrutiny I was applying. My professional knowledge of HOA regulations, municipal ordinances, and compliance codes allowed me to see each of her missteps not as chaos, but as tools. I documented every detail mentally: misplaced signage, unpermitted decorations, unclear property boundaries. The enforcer in crimson's unawareness of these violations meant I could build an airtight case, one that would eventually force accountability. Naomi's conflicted alignment was growing stronger. Her proximity and hesitations suggested she might corroborate observations if needed. The board chair had inadvertently exposed herself. Her obsession with control now worked against her. Karen Bellamy called for everyone to return to their homes, her voice snapping commands like a whip. The tyrant in heels believed she had regained control, yet I knew better. Each command she issued was now an opportunity to highlight overreach, a chance to record patterns of coercion and intimidation that could hold weight legally. Emily's anxious gaze met mine, and I silently promised her protection, both immediate and future. By late afternoon, the enforcer in crimson had unknowingly set the stage. The clipboard queen had escalated enough for residents to question her fairness, and for the legal and strategic groundwork to solidify in my mind. Naomi's conflicted role was almost ready to tip into active aid. Every move Karen Bellamy made now fed into the preparation for confrontation. The tyrant in heels had walked straight into a strategy I had carefully been shaping from observation, patience, and expert analysis. The board chair's own rigidity was becoming her undoing, and I could feel the shift coming. It was mid-morning when Naomi Cruz finally approached me. Her movements hesitant, almost cautious, like she was stepping into a territory she wasn't sure she belonged in. The clipboard queen had just stormed down the lane, Karen Bellamy barking orders at residents for minor infractions, and the enforcer in crimson's frustration was visible in the rigid set of her shoulders. Naomi's conflicted loyalty had become unbearable. She couldn't ignore the unfairness any longer. Her eyes darted nervously toward the tyrant in heels, checking to see if Karen Bellamy was watching. When she realized the board chair had moved further down the street, Naomi leaned in and whispered, "I saw her. Everything she did, it's all recorded in the HOA logs. I can help." My pulse quickened. The enforcer in crimson had underestimated Naomi's quiet observance. Every little action, every aggressive stance, every public humiliation of neighbors was now documented. A detailed account she was willing to confirm. The clipboard queen's overconfidence had created openings, and now finally we had leverage. Naomi explained how the tyrant in heels had skipped required notifications for board meetings, manipulated vote tallies, and even pushed minor fines through without proper approval. She handed me screenshots, timestamps, and voice recordings. The proof was undeniable. Karen Bellamy had left a trail of procedural violations that could not be ignored. I felt a wave of relief mixed with adrenaline. The board chair had finally stepped into a trap of her own making. Naomi's conflicted position had been building for weeks, and now she was stepping forward at precisely the right moment. The enforcer in crimson had acted like a master of intimidation, but in reality, she had created the exact evidence needed to challenge her authority. The tyrant in heel's obsession with control had blinded her to the consequences of her actions. As Naomi spoke, I could hear Karen Bellamy returning, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. The clipboard queen's expression was a mask of calm, but her eyes scanned the neighborhood, hunting for dissent. The enforcer in crimson had no idea that Naomi's confession would soon shift the balance of power. Each detail Naomi shared strengthened the professional case I had been assembling. Procedural violations, skipped legal steps, and improper enforcement of rules. Every piece of evidence now had a corroborating witness who had been right under Karen Bellamy's nose. Emily clung to my leg, sensing the tension. I crouched to meet her gaze, whispering reassurances, though I was acutely aware of the ticking clock. The board chair had a habit of striking quickly, reacting violently to perceived challenges. Yet, with Naomi's help, we had a blueprint for confronting her safely and strategically. The enforcer in crimson had unwittingly provided all the material we needed. I reviewed Naomi's information methodically, voice notes, email chains, HOA announcements that had been improperly posted, all pointed to the clipboard queen's overreach. The tyrant in heels had tried to present herself as infallible, but the digital trail told a different story. We could now anticipate her next moves, predict her arguments, and counter them with irrefutable proof. Karen Bellamy's confidence had become her vulnerability, and Naomi's disclosure was the keystone in the strategy I had been crafting for weeks. With the conflicted witness by my side, the plan became tangible. The enforcer in crimson would no longer operate unchecked. Naomi's courage to step forward had transformed passive observation into active intervention. The clipboard queen, who had intimidated neighbors for so long, would now face exposure of every procedural misstep. The tyrant in heel's dominance was not only challenged, but poised to collapse. We mapped out the sequence. First, present Naomi's testimony to the HOA board during the scheduled meeting. Next, document Karen Bellamy's reactions for additional evidence. Finally, leverage legal authority to ensure the board chair could not dismiss the findings. The enforcer in crimson had created the scenario, but it was Naomi's confession that turned potential into action. Emily's tiny hand rested in mine, a reminder of what was at stake. The board chair's tyranny had endangered more than property. It had directly threatened my daughter's safety. Naomi's support confirmed that we were not alone, that community accountability could prevail over abuse. The clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, and the enforcer in crimson would soon confront consequences born from their own arrogance. By the time Karen Bellamy re-entered the frame, our preparation was complete. Naomi had given me the tools, the insight, and the witness testimony necessary to execute the next phase. The board chair had unknowingly handed me the leverage that would unravel her control. The enforcer in crimson would now face the organized, strategic counter prepared meticulously over weeks, and the tyrant in heels was about to discover that her reign of intimidation had an expiration date. Armed with Naomi Cruz's confession, I retreated to my home office, a clutter of blueprints, legal references, and laptop screens, plotting the sequence that would finally confront Karen Bellamy. The clipboard queen had thought she controlled every interaction, every neighbor's fear, but now the enforcer in crimson's arrogance had left holes I could exploit. The tyrant in heels had ruled with intimidation, yet her overconfidence had inadvertently provided all the pieces I needed. I began organizing the evidence, cross-referencing timestamps from HOA emails with Naomi's recordings, and sketching out a strategy that relied not on brute force, but on precision and authority. Every detail mattered. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, had underestimated the ripple effects of her own actions. The enforcer in crimson had created a pattern: aggressive fines, threats, and unsanctioned rule enforcement. The clipboard queen's meticulous documentation, now paired with Naomi's insider testimony, formed a comprehensive trail of procedural violations. I highlighted each infraction, color-coding the sections: property violations enforced without notice, vote manipulations, and repeated intimidation of neighbors. The tyrant in heels had been careless. Her digital footprints and verbal threats now painted a perfect picture of abuse. I called a quick check-in with Naomi. She leaned against the doorway, her presence quiet but decisive. "I'll be there," she said, "every time, every statement. She won't intimidate us anymore." The enforcer in crimson had never considered that someone within the HOA would choose honesty over fear. The clipboard queen's meticulous attention to detail had become a weapon in the right hands. Karen Bellamy's smug confidence now had to confront the reality that her control was slipping. I mapped out the sequence of public exposure. First, present the records during the upcoming HOA board meeting. Then, strategically introduce Naomi's witness testimony, ensuring the board chair's overreach was undeniable. The tyrant in heels would be forced to react, and her responses would be captured in real time, creating a verifiable record. Every neighbor observing would see the enforcer in crimson's authority challenged by transparency, not confrontation. This was not revenge. It was accountability executed with professional precision. As I worked, Emily sat nearby, coloring quietly, unaware of the gravity of the plan, but her presence was a grounding force. Karen Bellamy's actions had targeted more than rules. They had endangered my daughter directly. The clipboard queen, the enforcer in crimson, and the tyrant in heels had all underestimated the personal stakes I carried. Naomi's support made it clear that community allies existed, and that fear could be replaced by action. Each detail in the plan leveraged both legal technicalities and procedural exposure. The board chair's authority could crumble under the weight of her own missteps. I tested each step in my mind. If Karen Bellamy reacted aggressively, we were ready with recorded evidence. If the clipboard queen tried to dismiss testimony, the timestamps and digital records would speak louder than any rhetoric. The enforcer in crimson had unwittingly set the stage for this confrontation. I rehearsed responses, ensured every recording was secure, and double-checked Naomi's information against public HOA filings. The tyrant in heels had left herself vulnerable, and I intended to exploit it fully. Late afternoon brought a quiet satisfaction. Naomi confirmed she would be present during the entire meeting. Emily's small hand in mine reminded me why I was committed to this fight. The board chair's intimidation wasn't abstract, it was personal. Karen Bellamy had believed her control absolute, but the enforcer in crimson had created cracks that no amount of threats could repair. The clipboard queen's diligence, coupled with Naomi's courage, had transformed fear into a tactical advantage. By evening, the plan was set. Karen Bellamy, the tyrant in heels, would walk into the HOA meeting expecting compliance, only to confront organized, undeniable evidence of her violations. The enforcer in crimson's miscalculations had become our blueprint. The clipboard queen's meticulous documentation had become our ammunition. Naomi's confession had provided the key to exposing the board chair's repeated overreach. And at the center of it all, I remained calm, focused, and ready to ensure that accountability, not intimidation, prevailed. The morning of the HOA meeting arrived like a storm hanging over the neighborhood. I checked the evidence one last time, arranging folders, digital recordings, and Naomi Cruz's testimony in a precise sequence. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, had already been texting neighbors, her tone authoritative, trying to assert control before the meeting even began. The enforcer in crimson had never anticipated that someone would combine legal acumen with personal stakes so methodically. The clipboard queen had always relied on her intimidation, but today, the tyrant in heels would confront transparency, accountability, and an unwavering resolve I had cultivated over days of preparation. I arrived early, the room nearly empty, and placed the materials on the conference table. Naomi followed, quiet and determined, scanning the empty chairs with a mixture of caution and relief. The board chair, Karen Bellamy, would not know the magnitude of what was coming. The enforcer in crimson had built her empire on fear, but today, each document, each timestamp, each recorded verbal overreach would chip away at that power. The clipboard queen's meticulous notes would be transformed into undeniable evidence. The tyrant in heels had created a trail of missteps that now worked in our favor. Neighbors trickled in, whispers of curiosity and concern filling the room. Emily stayed close to me, her small hand gripping mine, a reminder of the personal stakes. Karen Bellamy's authority loomed, but the enforcer in crimson's arrogance had left her unprepared for scrutiny. Naomi positioned herself strategically, ready to provide statements that corroborated every violation I had documented. The clipboard queen's diligent record-keeping would intersect perfectly with real-time testimony, creating a narrative the board chair could not dismiss. Every step of my plan relied on precision and observation. The meeting began. Karen Bellamy, in her usual commanding tone, opened with demands and assertions about property rules and community standards. The tyrant in heels leaned back, expecting nods of compliance, but the room's energy shifted subtly. I stood projecting calm authority and began presenting the evidence. Each violation of procedure, every threat issued without notice, every intimidation tactic the board chair had used was laid out in sequence. The enforcer in Crimson's overconfidence had provided timestamps and documentation that left no room for denial. The clipboard queen's record-keeping made the board chair's words crumble under their own weight. Neighbors' reactions ranged from shock to murmurs of disbelief. Naomi stepped forward, detailing first-hand accounts that confirmed each procedural abuse. The board chair, Karen Bellamy, sputtered at times, the tyrant in heels' composed facade cracking under pressure. The enforcer in Crimson had never imagined witnesses within the HOA would speak truthfully, but Naomi's courage, combined with the evidence, amplified every infraction. Every document, every testimony painted the clipboard queen's former meticulousness not as bureaucracy, but as a map of abuse. Questions erupted from the community, forcing Karen Bellamy to explain actions she had taken without legal authority. The enforcer in Crimson stumbled, and the board chair's attempts to redirect attention failed. Naomi's timely interjections highlighted the gap between claims and procedure, leaving the clipboard queen exposed as a figure of intimidation rather than leadership. The tyrant in heels had misjudged the room, underestimating the impact of factual presentation combined with personal stakes. By the meeting's midpoint, tension was palpable. The board chair, Karen Bellamy, attempted to regain control, but the enforcer in Crimson's own recorded missteps now undermined her. Naomi's testimony synchronized with the evidence, creating a clear narrative of abuse, threats, and violations. The clipboard queen's previous meticulousness had been weaponized against her. The tyrant in heels, so certain of compliance and fear, was confronted by unity, preparation, and unwavering determination. I watched as neighbors absorbed the information, whispers of disbelief and murmurs of support intertwining. Karen Bellamy's authority was visibly shaken. The enforcer in Crimson's tactics, once feared, now revealed vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. The clipboard queen's carefully noted infractions became our leverage. The tyrant in heels was facing the inevitable consequences of overreach. Our preparation, patience, and meticulous strategy had brought us to the brink of exposing systemic abuse in real time, and the board chair could not resist the weight of truth any longer. The air in the community hall was thick with tension as the final segment of preparation unfolded. I double-checked the layout, ensuring every piece of evidence and each strategic witness placement was flawless. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, would soon arrive, and the enforcer in Crimson's sense of superiority still lingered in the back of my mind. The clipboard queen's meticulous notes now served as a roadmap for confrontation, while the tyrant in heels, unaware of the traps we had set, continued her routine inspection of the hall, confident that intimidation would suffice. I felt Emily's hand clutch mine tightly, a physical reminder of why I had persisted through every confrontation. The stakes weren't about regulations or HOA policies alone. They were about safety, respect, and justice. Naomi Cruz positioned herself at a vantage point near the entrance, her eyes scanning for the board chair's first move. Every neighbor who had agreed to support us was quietly seated, the room charged with anticipation. Karen Bellamy, the enforcer in Crimson, and the clipboard queen had never faced a situation where their authority could be directly challenged in such a structured and public way. The doors opened, and Karen Bellamy swept in, projecting the same confidence that had long silenced dissent. The board chair's heels clicked against the polished floor, echoing a rhythm I had grown to associate with confrontation. The tyrant in heels scanned the room, taking measure of the audience, yet failing to notice Naomi's readiness or the strategic positioning of supportive neighbors. The enforcer in Crimson had always relied on surprise and fear, but today those tactics would falter against preparation, observation, and a meticulously crafted plan. I moved first, speaking with a calm authority that contrasted sharply with the board chair's aggressive entrance. "Karen Bellamy," I began, "we need to review your recent actions." The clipboard queen straightened, perhaps sensing that the tide of control had shifted. The enforcer in Crimson's confident expression wavered, a subtle tremor betraying her realization that she had underestimated the level of scrutiny she would face. Every word I had prepared, every visual aid, every time-stamped recording now worked together to corner the board chair in a legally undeniable narrative. The first video was projected, capturing Karen Bellamy, our board chair, grabbing Emily by the hair in violation of community and legal standards. Gasps filled the hall, and murmurs of disbelief spread quickly. The tyrant in heels, usually unshakable, faltered as neighbors witnessed firsthand the aggression that had been whispered about but never documented. Naomi stepped forward, recounting the sequence of events leading up to the incident, confirming the timeline and corroborating each detail captured on camera. The enforcer in Crimson's earlier attempts at control now felt powerless. I paced deliberately, guiding the community through the evidence with clarity. Each slide, each recording, each corroborating statement was a calculated escalation, designed to remove every avenue of denial. Karen Bellamy's posture tightened. The clipboard queen's poised mask slipped subtly. The board chair's attempts at interruption were cut short by prearranged neighbor questions, each designed to highlight procedural violations and breaches of ethical conduct. The tyrant in heels was cornered in the most public, undeniable way possible. As the crescendo of evidence unfolded, I could see the transformation in the room. Neighbors, once passive observers, were now emotionally engaged, supportive, and attentive to every violation. Naomi's poised testimony had humanized the situation, turning abstract rules into personal stakes. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, attempted a final deflection, but the room's unified focus, combined with our strategic orchestration, left her with nowhere to retreat. By the meeting's climax, the enforcer in Crimson's strategy had collapsed entirely. The clipboard queen's careful record-keeping had become proof against the tyrant in heels. The board chair, Karen Bellamy, faced undeniable evidence in front of an audience that demanded accountability. My preparation, the witnesses' courage, and the calculated presentation had aligned perfectly, positioning us for the final resolution. The stage was set, and there was no turning back. The courtroom doors opened with a hollow echo, and the gravity of the moment settled like a weight on my shoulders. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, swept in with her usual air of authority, the tyrant in heels following closely behind, clipboard in hand, her notes trembling slightly under the tension. The enforcer in crimson trailed, scanning the room as if searching for a loophole, a weakness she could exploit, yet the confident expressions of the neighbors and witnesses told a different story. The clipboard queen adjusted her papers nervously, already sensing that the carefully constructed narrative we had prepared would leave her boss exposed. I took a deep breath, steadying Emily, who clutched my hand with quiet strength. Today wasn't about intimidation or petty power plays. It was about justice and accountability. I had arranged for every neighbor who had witnessed Karen Bellamy's actions, along with the conflicted witness, Naomi Cruz, to be ready to testify. The room was set for a public reckoning. I could feel the tension rising, the same tension I had sensed in every community meeting and confrontation that had led us here. The judge entered, and a hush fell over the courtroom. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, attempted her usual commanding presence, projecting confidence as if her position alone could protect her. The tyrant in heels scanned the audience, her calculated smile fading under the intense gaze of neighbors who had grown tired of her overreach. The enforcer in crimson shifted uneasily, realizing that intimidation could no longer dominate the narrative. The clipboard queen's carefully maintained notes were about to be used against her in the most public way imaginable. The first witness took the stand, and the evidence rolled out. Photographs, timestamps, videos capturing Karen Bellamy grabbing Emily by the hair in the community parking lot. Gasps filled the room as the reality of her aggression became undeniable. The tyrant in heels faltered, unable to interrupt the sequence without drawing more attention to herself. Naomi Cruz, the conflicted witness, was next. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice carried steady authority as she recounted the moments leading up to the incident, confirming every detail that exposed the board chair's misconduct. I leaned forward, watching the courtroom absorb the gravity of the situation. Each neighbor who had once hesitated now nodded, their presence amplifying the weight of accountability. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, tried to interject, to sway opinion with rehearsed lines, but the evidence was relentless. The enforcer in crimson looked down, realizing that her strategies of fear and control were no longer effective. The clipboard queen's notes had become irrefutable proof, systematically dismantling the tyrant in heel's authority. The judge's gaze shifted toward the board chair, and the room seemed to pause in anticipation. The combination of direct witness testimony, video evidence, and community support left Karen Bellamy with no defense. The tyrant in heel's attempts to assert dominance were met with silence, the weight of accountability pressing down like a physical force. My heart pounded as I realized the culmination of months of preparation, courage, and strategic planning had brought us to this pivotal moment. Finally, the judge spoke, a firm tone that cut through the tension. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, was ordered to be handcuffed for her actions, a legal and public acknowledgement of the abuse of power she had carried out in front of our entire community. The tyrant in heel's mask of composure cracked, and the enforcer in crimson could only watch as their carefully curated image crumbled. The clipboard queen's meticulous records had been the final piece of undeniable evidence, ensuring accountability would not be avoided. The courtroom erupted with a mix of relief and quiet celebration. Neighbors whispered thanks and encouragement, Emily hugged me tightly, and Naomi's expression shifted from fear to pride. The public confrontation had achieved exactly what we had planned: exposure, accountability, and a clear precedent that abuse of authority, even by a powerful HOA figure, would not go unchallenged. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, had finally faced the consequences she had long avoided. As I looked around the courtroom, I felt a deep sense of justice and closure. Every preparation, every confrontation, every witness had mattered. This wasn't just about one incident. It was a statement that the community would stand together, and the tyrant in heels would no longer dictate fear in silence. The courthouse hallway felt surreal as the echo of the gavel faded, leaving a tense silence broken only by whispers of relief. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, had been handcuffed, escorted past the stunned crowd, her tyrant in heels persona fractured, every confident stride replaced by the weight of accountability. The enforcer in crimson lingered behind, her usual menace dulled, while the clipboard queen clutched her notes tightly, finally realizing that her carefully curated authority had failed. I kept Emily close, feeling her small hand gripping mine, a quiet reminder of why every confrontation, every risk had mattered. Outside, sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, a stark contrast to the tension we had endured inside. Neighbors, once intimidated by the board chair's dominance, now approached us with cautious smiles and quiet gratitude. The community that had been divided, fearful, and silenced was slowly finding its voice. I watched as Naomi Cruz, the conflicted witness, stood slightly apart, eyes glistening with pride, having contributed the crucial testimony that had dismantled Karen Bellamy's carefully constructed narrative. Her conflicted loyalty had transformed into courage, and it had made all the difference. As we stepped into the open courtyard, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Karen Bellamy, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, and the tyrant in heels, all the faces of intimidation, were behind us now, their authority exposed as hollow. Emily ran ahead, laughter bubbling from her lips, the innocence of a child untouched by fear. This was what the fight had been for: protection, justice, and a restored sense of safety in our own neighborhood. The board chair's downfall had set a precedent, one that ensured no parent, no child, would ever face arbitrary cruelty without consequence. I spoke quietly to Emily, knowing she would remember this day far longer than I ever would. We stood our ground, and we won. Her eyes shone with understanding, and in that moment, the months of stress, confrontation, and planning felt worth every second. Karen Bellamy had underestimated the combined force of legal authority, community support, and strategic preparation. The clipboard queen's meticulous documentation, the enforcer in crimson's silent fear, and the tyrant in heels unraveling, all had converged to expose the truth. Neighbors began to gather around, offering congratulations, support, and words of encouragement. The sense of unity was palpable, a stark contrast to the days when the board chair's overreach had sown division and intimidation. Naomi Cruz approached, her demeanor calm but firm, and whispered her thanks, a reminder that even those once complicit could choose courage. I nodded, understanding that the victory was never mine alone. It belonged to the community, to every person who refused to stay silent, and to every witness who spoke truth despite fear. As the crowd dispersed, I looked back toward the courthouse steps, imagining Karen Bellamy's expression, the tyrant in heels now subdued by the undeniable consequences of her actions. The enforcer in crimson and the clipboard queen would have to reckon with the same reality. No amount of intimidation could override accountability when evidence, courage, and strategy converged. The fight had been long, emotionally charged, and psychologically taxing, but it had proven that persistence, preparation, and standing up for what was right could topple even the most entrenched authority. Walking Emily to our car, I reflected on the journey. The victory strategy, outside authority intervention, had worked not just because it was methodical, but because it was guided by principle, community engagement, and timing. Karen Bellamy, the board chair, had finally been held accountable, but more importantly, the neighborhood had been reminded of the power of unity and courage. The tyrant in heels' reign of fear was over, replaced by a sense of justice that would resonate for years to come. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Today wasn't just my victory, it was ours. The board chair's fall marked a turning point, a lesson in resilience, courage, and the power of taking a stand. Emily squeezed my hand, and in that simple gesture, I knew we had achieved something far greater than a legal win. We had restored dignity, safety, and hope to our home and community.